Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 264. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. Today, the co-host is Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing?
I'm great, Kyle. How are you?
Doing very well, Connor. And we are just about at the end of our Libertarian Institute fundraiser, Connor. This is where myself and you both work. You are a writer for us at the Institute, and I am the news editor. You have a new article out today that is actually the spotlight at antiwar.com as we speak. And it may be no longer the spotlight by the time most people listen to this episode, but it was up as the spotlight at antiwar.com. And so you're putting together very high quality articles, and then I'm writing some news for the Institute as well as putting out this show. So if you'd like to continue to support our work, head on over to the Libertarian Institute. You could get some great kickbacks as well as supporting, again, what I think is some very important work that me and Connor are doing. So Connor, we should also mention the shows on YouTube, Rumble, and Odyssey for the video version. There's a Facebook page. Twitter is @con_interest, and then you can also follow the show on the Libertarian Institute all podcast feed, or it has its own feed anywhere you listen to podcasts. The sponsor of the show is Paloma Verde, PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Promo code PEACE. That saves you 20% off when you spend $75 or more, and it gets the show a kickback. So it's a great way to get yourself some high quality CBD and at the same time supporting your favorite podcast. All right, Connor, let's get into it and start with some news stories today before we get into your article. And some important ones I think that I actually wrote up yesterday for the Libertarian Institute. The first one is titled U.S. Official, We Are Always Preparing the Next Weapons Package for Ukraine. And I write, White House official Matt Miller said the U.S. is planning multiple weapons packages for Ukraine in the coming weeks. President Joe Biden has already authorized the transfer of over $3 billion in arms to Kiev amid a war which American officials believe will last for years. Speaking with MSNBC on Tuesday, Miller said the questions about another package is really just the easiest one you could ask me. The answer is yes, of course. We are always preparing the next package of security assistance to get to Ukraine. Several top officials have said the war will drag on for years. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mark Milley, said, I do think this is a very protracted conflict, and I think it's measured in years. I don't know about decades, but at least years for sure. Several current and former high-level U.S. officials believe Russia will face a bloody and costly insurgency fueled by American weapons in Ukraine. In January, James Stavridis, a retired four-star Navy admiral who was the supreme allied commander for NATO, said Putin should realize that after fighting insurgencies ourselves for 2 decades, we know how to arm and train and energize them. On Tuesday, Biden responded affirmatively to a question asking if the next armed security package would include artillery. Last week, the White House announced an $800 million arms package transfer to Kiev that includes howitzers. Since Biden took office, the U.S. has transferred over $3 billion in weapons to Ukraine, and that number will increase to over $3 billion just since the February 24th invasion by Russia alone. If this next arms package ends up materializing, that Dave DeCamp covered for antiwar.com yesterday. It's supposed to be another $800 million arms package that the Biden administration is supposed to approve either this week or next week. Just money that the White House, weapons that the White House is choosing to dole out without any kind of approval for Congress. The U.S. isn't at war, Connor, but this is just going on. Another thing to point out is that despite all the assistance that the U.S. is giving Ukraine, several lawmakers are saying it's not enough. And this includes Democrat Senator Chris Coons, who said, come to a common position about whether when we are willing to go to the next steps and not just send our arms but troops to aid the defense of Ukraine. If the answer is never, then we are inviting another level of escalation and brutality by Putin. And so Connor, it's not enough what we're already doing. They're demanding more. Now, maybe even more important of a story, I think, is the next one. And so we know they're sending billions in weapons into Ukraine, Connor, and they're planning on sending billions more, it seems. But they also can't track those weapons. So the other article I had yesterday from the Libertarian Institute, White House has almost zero ability to track weapons it sends to Ukraine. A U.S. official said the White House has almost zero ability to track the weapons it is sending to Ukraine. So far, Biden has approved over $3 billion in arms shipments to Kiev. Speaking with CNN about weapons, one source said, "We have fidelity for a short time, but when it enters the fog of war, we have almost zero. It drops into a big black hole, and you have almost no sense of it at all after a short period of time." The source said the U.S. lacked personnel on the ground, making it nearly impossible to track the movement of weapons. Another source told CNN Ukraine was incentivized to lie to get access to more weapons, saying, "It is a war. Every statement is information operation. Every interview, every Zelensky appearance broadcast is an information operation." The U.S. infamously armed the resistance to Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, only to have many of those weapons fall into the hands of the Islamic State and other al-Qaeda affiliate groups. The consequence was an Islamic caliphate that took over large swaths of Iraq and Syria, and also there's an al-Qaeda stand that lingers in the Idlib province of Syria to this day, and all those arms, that fueled these militant groups that carried out the most heinous crimes. I mean, far worse than Bashar al-Assad, Connor. And they just got away with it because they were backed by the U.S. ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda continues to linger. And hell, the U.S. is still interested in supporting al-Jawlani's Al-Qaeda affiliate group in Syria to this very day against Bashar al-Assad, also seeing this as a way to bleed Russia because Assad is a key ally of Russia. Going back, Russia maintains a key military base in Syria, but also because Russia has now entered that war, and so the more that the U.S. fuels the opposition to Assad, the more Russia is going to have to spend to eliminate it, is their calculation. In Ukraine, neo-Nazi groups like the Azov Battalion have been incorporated into the armed forces. In a recent interview, President Volodymyr Zelensky was asked about the presence of these extremist groups within Ukraine's military. Zelensky insisted that we are defending our country, saying they are what they are, essentially admitting that, yeah, they're neo-Nazis, but we're going to use them to defend our country. The inability to track arms is not deterring the U.S. from sending weapons to Ukraine. Last week, Biden approved an $800 million weapons package, and then I mentioned here again the statement from Matt Miller about we're always playing the next one. The U.S. claims the arms transfers have been successful with little interference from Moscow. And a third source speaking with CNN says Russia is not threatening the weapon shipments. The outlet also reported that it does not appear Russia has been actively attacking Western weapon shipments entering Ukraine, although it is unclear exactly why, especially since the U.S. intelligence that the Russians want to have and have discussed all doing so both publicly and privately. So this is kind of a curious thing, Connor, assuming it's true. Remember, this is a CNN report talking to sources, and so there could be some maybe untruth inserted here, but I think the inability to track weapons definitely is counter narrative. In that article, they also say that they have a hard time tracking casualties, and so despite the fact that the U.S. is reporting all these casualties either of civilians or Russian soldiers, remember that the U.S. admits that they're having trouble actually tracking that, and so I'm guessing they're giving pretty inflated numbers. But then they say that Russia isn't able to strike the weapons shipments. We do know know they hit the facility, the Yarmouth, or the International Security and Training Center that's near the border with Poland, and Russia claims, and I believe it's pretty confirmed at this point, that there were international weapons stored there, Stinger missiles that were destroyed in that attack, along with some people killed, including potentially Western or foreign fighters in Ukraine. So, with this, it's just very important, Connor. Who knows what kind of long-term consequences we're going to have in Ukraine by pouring in weapons, especially when you have a war going on. Who knows how much authority and coordination actually is coming out of Kiev, and so these weapons could just end up in the hands of the most extremist fighters, because they're the ones most willing to use them and go to the front of the battlefield, and it could give them a lot of power. And like we saw, not just in Afghanistan with Operation Cyclone, right? I was just looking today. I think it's Zbigniew Brzezinski, who said in 1998 that one of the that it was destroying and liberating Eastern Europe versus some pissed off Muslims, or stirred up Muslims, I think is what he said. Obviously, that 3 years later, those stirred up Muslims flew some planes into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. So that's a pretty serious consequence. And of course, failing to also acknowledge that 1 million Afghans died in that. So, Connor, just a few more stories that I want to touch on before I kick it over to you. Dave DeCamp here at antiwar.com writes that the British SAS are training troops in Ukraine, which is pretty serious. I'm kind of surprised that this is going on. It seems completely unnecessary to me, especially if what CNN is saying is true, Connor, and they can transport weapons over the border without Russian interference. Why not carry out this training in Poland or in Slovakia or another bordering country, or even in the UK, and just fly the troops either to the border with Ukraine and then drive them in, or fly them right into Kiev? Why put all these UK forces at risk? I guess one possibility is, Connor, maybe they're testing the waters. They're seeing that if they put Western troops in Ukraine, if that does create a red line that Russia is unwilling to cross. The NATO policy, for at least at this point, they are working on reviving it. But for the Baltic states and Poland, is to have tripwire forces, Connor. They believe that if they have a few hundred or a few thousand NATO forces in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, Russia wouldn't risk killing that many people from Germany, the UK, France, and the US, and so they won't invade. And maybe they're looking at doing that in a creeping fashion in Ukraine by putting in these troops to train Ukrainian forces, and then they say, well, Russia won't attack Kiev if our forces are there, so they keep adding more and more and more. And this is, in a way, could almost make Ukraine a de facto NATO member state in a very creepy way. But it certainly does make the UK a party to this conflict, which I think was probably the case before, but now it definitely has to be true, Connor. I mean, they're training a fighting force within a country that force is fighting in, so they certainly are a party to this conflict now. Let's see. I don't think there's anything else in this article I really wanted to get into. There is also reports that a NATO ally state is transferring aircraft and then giving parts to Ukraine, and that Ukraine's fighter fleet is growing, according to John Kirby, although the details on that are pretty slim at this point. So I'm kind of waiting and seeing what's going on and if these weapons can actually make any kind of impact on the battlefield. Another important article by Dave DeCamp, titled "Russian Ambassador to U.S. Says Biden Officials Don't Want to Speak with Him." Dave writes, the Russian ambassador to the U.S., Antonoli Antonov, told Politico in an interview published on Monday that he cannot get meetings with senior Biden administration officials at the White House and State Department. Who took the Washington Post took the Post in Washington in 2017 said that his letters to meet with U.S. senators and House representatives have also been rejected. He said that the Russian embassy still maintains lower level contacts with the Biden administration, but described the situation as a blockade. Frankly, we are in a blockade. When it comes to Washington, my idea was to use the word improvement to describe his goals for the relationship. Now I prefer to use the word stabilization. And this is very troubling, Connor. The U.S. needs to be putting talks on the table with Russia to end this conflict. Obviously, a lot of what's happening in Ukraine has to do with the fact that the U.S. has looked to make Ukraine a NATO member state and has increasingly treated Ukraine like a NATO member, but it also has to do with the larger security situation in Europe and NATO expansion and all the movement of U.S. weapons into Eastern Europe, the deployment of the Aegis Ashore missile defense systems, which could also hold strategic nuclear weapons and deliver warheads to Moscow very quickly, are issues that I think have provoked Russia to invade Ukraine. But at the same time, a key issue is the NATO issue, and this can be discussed with Russia, but the U.S. and the White House at this point are just absolutely declining to do so, and that's extremely troubling, Connor. Now, there are more bad news on the potential negotiations. According to a Zelensky advisor, he says no peace talks if the Russians take Mariupol. And by every indication I can see in maps, Connor, that city is very near falling completely into the hands of Russian forces. There's maybe some forces held out at a very large, but a steel factory nonetheless. That is a pretty limited location. And then sanctions are continuing to pile up, with Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen pushing for other countries to ramp up sanctions on Russia. And particularly, there's a coalition or a group of a delegation of U.S. senators and representatives that are in Serbia, which is an ally of Russia, pushing for Serbia to sanction Russia as well. And of course, this is all about the U.S. policy to isolate Russia. This is as much as it's about Ukraine, Connor, it's really about Russia, right? It is the conflict in Ukraine that has prompted some of these policies, but in a general sense, I think this is all about maintaining U.S. dominance and everything like that, and taking Russia down a peg, and just the hubris of the people in Washington, like Victoria Nuland, Jade Sullivan, and Antony Blinken, who think that they can make that happen, and the sociopathy of these people who are willing to, in the same way that they wrapped up the bodies of Syrians and Afghans and Libyans to take, to play various geopolitical cards, or to, like against the USSR, against Iran, and then to take out Gaddafi in Libya. All these things were the idea of promoting U.S. hegemony, which, of course, has made disasters and has been even worse in almost every single case. So, Connor, I think that's about all the news that I had to cover on today's show. And now I want you to talk about this great new article that you have for the Libertarian Institute, that is, again, the spotlight today at antiwar.com, titled, "We Want You to Keep That War Going." What's going on, Connor?
All right. So the point of this one, the way I was really inspired to write this after reading an article that you and Will wrote about 2 weeks ago about that revelation in the Washington Post about how, well, I'll just read the quote. So, and I wish this would have gotten more attention overall, that more people should know about this, because I don't know, I'd like to know how much the American people are aware of this. But they said out, right there in the paper that some NATO states prefer Ukrainians continue fighting and dying. Let's see. That leads to an awkward reality. For some in NATO, it's better for Ukrainians to keep fighting and dying than to achieve a peace that comes too early or at too high a cost to Kiev and the rest of Europe. And this is in reference to, the idea of Ukraine declaring that they have no intention of joining NATO. That's even kind of a third rail for some of these NATO member states who want to see the war continue. And as I say, that the way they phrase it for the Post article is a little deceptive, when in fact they really aren't concerned, obviously, as you were just talking about, with the cost to the Ukrainians. This is about making sure, the cost is too high. Does that even make any sense? Logically, we want the war to continue to lower the cost on the Ukrainians. No, I mean, this is about ensuring that Moscow suffers more. So their real concern is that the outcome would come at too low a cost for Moscow and Russia. And this is, as I quote here from another report from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. He quotes Joseph Borrell, the EU foreign policy chief, saying essentially the same thing, saying, we want to end it as soon as possible, but not in any way, because if we're going to have a destroyed country that has been dismembered territorially, so right there he's, ruling out concessions on the Donbass and the Crimea, and neutralize, so dismember territorially and neutralize me. So, neutrality he wants to take off the table, with millions of people in exile and millions of people dead. Then no, we don't want the war to end like this. And he says this is why we must, quote, continue arming Ukraine, more weapons. That is what the Ukrainians expect of us. And so, this dovetails with, as you were just talking about, Zelensky has come out and said recently that he will absolutely not recognize Crimea. I mean, previously they had discussed like, oh, maybe there'll be these like 15-year talks and this sort of thing. But he is now taking that off the table. And all this stuff about Mariupol, to say that we're going to cut off talks entirely if they take the city. This is basically, the Ukrainians are saying that they don't want to negotiate anymore. And of course, one of the Russian accusations in that formal diplomatic note that was handed to the from the Russian embassy in Washington to the State Department, they said that NATO is pressuring Ukraine to essentially abandon the talks. And I think that is what we're seeing. All this reporting that comes out, and if you look at the actual policies, they're preparing to indefinitely isolate Russia and cut them off economically. I mean, certainly Europe is. So the EU is talking about banning oil now and gas, and they already have drafted a plan to cut off all the coal imports, but in 4 months from now, I believe is the timeline. And they said in that same Post article that came out recently about how they have this long-term plan to isolate and weaken Russia, that they intend to cut off all energy imports by 2030. So just to give everybody an idea of how long they expect this conflict and this policy to go on. Now, we kind of knew this earlier because there have been reports in the Financial Times and elsewhere where they were saying, and we kind of saw this too, like they kept announcing all the sanctions. There was never any real discussion of, what Russia could do to get sanctions relief. I think until it's becoming pretty obvious now that it's just economic war for economic war's sake, and they want to punish Russia, basically to really hobble and cripple and, as they say, crush Russia. The crushing sanctions, they're not going to be lifted. But the original idea, even when they were saying like, we're not going to connect it to a negotiated settlement, they were basically saying that Russia needs to make an unconditional surrender for this to even be considered. But of course, that was never going to happen. And so, we knew even back then, I mentioned that or cited that in an article I wrote at the beginning of this month, that, we've known for a while now that the sanctions policy is here to stay, and that it's designed to basically preclude a negotiated settlement. And that's one of the other things I mentioned here in terms of the Lend-Lease legislation that got unanimous support in the Senate. As Michael Tracy, I quote here, notes, even Bernie Sanders and Rand Paul supported this. This is, the World War II program that was the precursor to U.S. intervention in World War II. And, we gave adjusted for inflation, I think it's somewhere near $200 billion to the Soviet Union, of course, supplying military aid to the French and the British and the Chinese. And this, so, I mean, this is after 75 years, we're bringing this back for a war in Ukraine against Russia that arguably the US and NATO provoked. And this is, I mean, you hear Chris Coons talking about sending U.S. troops. And what is his justification? He doesn't really have a justification. I mean, if you watch he's walking it back now, which I'm glad to see. I don't expect people like, excuse me, Adam Kinzinger to walk back his calls for a similar policy, no-fly zone, sending troops. But Coons is now walking it back. But his original justification was, we have to do this because of the brutality. The brutality is just that's being unleashed. How, what did he say? The history of the 21st century, I believe, will turn on how fiercely we defend freedom in Ukraine. And he goes, and we don't want Ukraine to turn into Syria. Like it's, again, the U.S. is never responsible. Assad evidently, killed. The implication, of course, even I used to point out, even on Bernie Sanders' campaign website, pinned virtually all of the deaths in the Syrian war on Assad alone. And of course, and Russia, right? And so that's Coons's, that's what he's basically saying, that this is, another war where Russia kills hundreds of thousands of people. But again, as you just pointed out with your comparison to the dirty war in Syria and Timber Sycamore, this is a U.S. proxy war designed to bleed not our enemy, not the American people's enemy. They might try and convince the American people, and they seem to be doing a pretty good job of convincing people that Moscow and the Russian people are our enemy. But the fact is, these are strategic adversaries of U.S. global domination. If you're talking about Tehran in the Middle East, or Russia in Eastern Europe, or China in East Asia, and this sort of thing. So they have, they're basically they don't, I mean, like he's saying, to sending troops because of the brutality. He doesn't really have a justification, but just the fact that they're shifting the Overton window like this is very, very dangerous. And of course, if I had known about the British SAS deployment in Ukraine before I got the article finished, I would have added that in there. So what I also did was, after I go through this rhetoric from the EU and these NATO states and these reports, I go in and talk about some of the most recent escalations. Now, some of these numbers, the article only came out yesterday. They're already out of date because, as you said, Biden has announced yet another $800 million weapons aid package. So, at this point, if you break it down, you're looking at, so before the war, the U.S., starting under Trump, had provided the American coup regime in Kiev about 2.7, roughly $3 billion in military aid. Since the war started, Biden has provided, now about $3.5 billion. And let's not forget, in that massive omnibus bill that we covered a few shows ago, the Biden administration pledged, or Washington pledged, $3.5 billion to replenish weapons stocks that are meant to be shipped to Ukraine. So we're talking, who knows how much of that is actually in these, in these packages that are coming out, $100 million here, $800 million here or there. But, that's about, nearly $10 billion. So in this military aid. So, of course, we know that, and I talk in here about how Austin is now coming out and saying, yeah, we're providing intelligence to them for their operations in the Donbass. And so, of course, what that means is, in addition to discussing how, Biden saying, we're training Ukrainian troops in Poland, and the Lithuanians are saying that they have a whole plan to start training the Ukrainians on weapons systems, NATO weapons systems in Lithuania, and the U.S. that's a possible location for this training on the howitzers. But of course, this is so after this this massive let's see. So after Biden's gaffe about Poland, about the training of the troops, there was a subsequent meeting of NATO foreign ministers in Brussels, and that's where they announced that they were going to be sending what they call it newer and heavier armaments. And what that has included primarily have been these shipments of heavy artillery, the howitzers, tens of thousands of rounds of ammunition, and of course these sea drones and more switchblade kamikaze drones, and of course hundreds of armored personnel carriers, hundreds of Humvees, attack helicopters, the Russian helicopters that were originally earmarked for the now collapsed formerly U.S.-backed government in Afghanistan. So they are absolutely ramping it up. Of course, Slovakia is talking about sending MiG-29s to Ukraine, which, originally we thought we dodged a bullet on this escalation because Biden and the Americans had basically said, even after Blinken opened his mouth and said, I forget what his quote was, but essentially he had said, we've given Poland the green light to transfer the MiG-29s. And then the Polish said, okay, yeah, we'll give them all to, we'll send them all to Germany, I think at the Ramstein Air Base, and then you can take them over there. And then the Americans like, no, they're not going to do that. But now, of course, Slovakia is talking about sending these MiG-29s and having them replaced with F-16s that they've already ordered from the Americans. They've already transferred over S-300 air defense systems. Russia bombed these systems recently once they got into Ukraine. Now, the Bratislava disputes that those were the ones that they had transferred over, but the timeline seems to match up pretty well. And anyway, at this meeting, Liz Truss made the point that that NATO needs to start training the Ukrainians on how to use these NATO arms because they don't want Ukraine to continue to be primarily reliant on these old Soviet-era weapons, which is what they're mostly trained to use. Even the Stinger missiles, for instance. I mean, that's one of the things when these reports in Politico came out and elsewhere about how, how they were trying to clarify Biden's gaffe about training troops in Poland. They were saying, well, or what was Kirby saying? They're liaising with the troops. They're interacting. It's not like training, but and they say in the report that they're likely teaching them how to use these Stinger missiles to kill Russians and to shoot down Russian aircraft. So, we're getting more and more reports, as I say, about providing increased intelligence for these, and I find it interesting that there is an uptick in attacks inside Russian territory now. There was that recent attack on a village 6 miles from the border with Ukraine, I believe in a village called Klimovo, where 7 people were injured. I think the Russians said that they sent 2 attack helicopters with heavy weaponry, launched at least 6 airstrikes on this village. But, of course, this is on the heels of that attack on that fuel depot in I'm blanking on the name of the Belgorod in Russia a couple weeks ago. And there have been some other attacks before that were covered in The Guardian. Now the Americans and these pieces in the Wall Street Journal, when they're talking about this increased intelligence, they go, but we're not providing them intelligence for attacks inside Russian territory, which I just find interesting that they say that and then attacks start happening in Russian territory. I'm not jumping to conclusions, but it's odd that they would make that qualification, because we would hope that would be, you would assume as much. I mean, they shouldn't be doing what they're doing now, but that would be a major escalation, of course. But who knows? We've gotten all these reports lately coming out, especially that infamous one in NBC a week or two ago about how, they go, we're in this information war with Putin, so we're putting out a lot of false information or information that we have low confidence in, but it's just to get inside his head. But of course, this is mostly actually about getting in the American people's head. So, you have to keep that in mind when you read these statements. But let's see. So, of course, now I mentioned that in Mississippi, a program just wrapped up where the U.S. was training at a sort of a naval academy. They were teaching the Ukrainians in Mississippi drone warfare with the Switchblades and naval warfare course. And those forces, I think Austin said, have returned to Ukraine or are returning to Ukraine now. Now, let's see. The Czech Republic, of course, is sending Soviet-era tanks to Ukraine, and the Czech Republic and Slovakia are talking about, opening their military industrial facilities to start repairing myriad tanks, vehicles, and other arms the Ukrainians have, and as well as those that they've captured from the Russians during the war. And then I reference in here and link to your article about how there's also concurrently this massive NATO buildup. Now, currently we have reportedly about 100,000 troops in Europe, the most since 2005. Tens of thousands of which have been sent just this year, and increased deployments and new battle groups being formed in the wake of Putin's invasion. And most of these forces, or many of them, are going to, countries that border Ukraine and Russia. Now, the ostensible purpose of the NATO buildup in Eastern Europe now, they're saying, is to repel a Russian invasion, which translates to win a war with Russia, right? Of course, this presupposes that it would remain conventional, which is a joke, and obviously this is going to be a very neurologic issue for Russia, and makes nuclear war much more likely, and World War III much more likely. Now, of course, Milley and other defense officials are saying that they want NATO countries to build more permanent bases, and that they're going to be sending U.S. troops to rotate through these regularly. And I also talk about how, this is really a dream come true for the military-industrial complex, because we're seeing increased spending from all these countries on not just military aid to Ukraine. For instance, Germany just announced that they're I think spending roughly like 2 billion euros now, and most of that envelope, as they said, is going to be in military aid to Ukraine. They're running out of weapons to send to Ukraine, so now they're just, in their own stocks. Their defense ministry is saying, so now they're asking their military contractors to start sending weapons, and they basically said, Ukraine has given us a wish list and all this kind of stuff. So now. So we're spending more on the military at this point. We were last year, but it's gone up, quite a bit since. Now we're at $813 billion is proposed for the 2023 budget. This is the most we've ever spent. I mean, this is more than the Cold War, the peak of Vietnam, the Korean War, all this. So this is absolutely a real boon for the worst elements of the deep state here in the country. And of course, they don't care about the Ukrainians, the Russians, the Europeans, the Americans, the world economy, all these people that are, posed to starve from the food shortages and the food crisis and the energy crisis that's knocking on the door currently. This is, they're making, well over $1 trillion a year now on all this. So, and of course, Lloyd Austin is, a former board member on Raytheon, and the Stinger missiles, for instance, which everybody is going, we've got to open up new supply lines, and we have to have, we were talking about this recently, how they were talking to the new nominee Biden has for weapons procurement for the Pentagon, and you have these lawmakers, basically, going nuts, just saying like, we've got to have these, I forget how they described it, but basically they want to open up new production lines. We've got to have more and more Stingers and Javelins. We're running out. We need to replenish the stocks and send them over constantly. We've already sent thousands and thousands. But the Stinger missiles, for instance, those are entirely Raytheon products. The Javelin anti-tank missiles are a joint project between Lockheed and Raytheon. Of course, and these are, this is very expensive equipment, and they announce, as you were just talking about, the guy said that they're always planning the next weapons package, and there seems to be a new military aid package announced every week. This is only, as the Russians have said recently, pouring fuel on the conflict and making it worse. And of course, this is, the Russians have said, like, we will start targeting, your weapons transfers and any U.S. and NATO vehicles carrying these weapons over Ukraine's borders into the conflict zone. These are legitimate targets. And we're warning you, stop doing this. Because they know. In fact, they even said, you're trying to inflict casualties on us, and slow the operation. And also, it's you're trying to get people in the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics militaries and in this region killed. So they've issued a warning. I mean, right, very early on in the war, Putin put his nuclear forces on high alert, or some of them, and this whole idea of bringing Finland and Sweden into NATO. I think it was Medvedev, who came out, Dmitry Medvedev, the former president, is now on the Russian Security Council, who came out and said, look, we're going to have to reinforce our nuclear presence on the border, or in the Baltic, on the border with the Baltic region. And we don't want to, but if you're going to do this, you're extending the border, the NATO-Russia border by 800 miles, and so obviously everything the U.S. is doing, including these bills that continue to get passed, unanimously by the Senate, whether it's the Lend-Lease program I mentioned earlier, or this suspending normal trade relations with Russia and Belarus, paving the way for tariffs and more tariffs, tariffs and other punitive measures, and this whole idea of just completely cutting off Russian energy from America and Europe. All these things make war with the U.S. and Russia and NATO and Russia much, much more likely. And so there's also the point with the whole thing about the Lend-Lease thing is that they're saying that in the bill's summary, they mentioned that this program will continue until, let's see, they say will go on until the conflict beginning with Russia's annexation of the Crimea region of Ukraine in 2014 has ceased, and Russia has reduced its military force on Ukraine's eastern border to the levels maintained prior to March 1st, 2021. So again, I mean, the way I read this is that they're saying that they want Russia to give up Crimea, which they know they won't do. That's been the home of their only year-round warm water port, and that's where their Black Sea Fleet has been based for hundreds of years, since before the U.S. Constitution was ratified. And they're not giving it up. They lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers defending it from the Nazis in World War II. So this is designed to go on, as they've said. It's going to be a protracted conflict. We've been hearing quotes like that from Jake Sullivan, from Antony Blinken. Mark Milley said to the House Armed Services Committee he expects this war to go on for years and years. And he goes, I'm not saying a decade, but certainly for years. And they just held this meeting with the military-industrial complex, the 8 CEOs of the biggest companies, at the Pentagon, with Kathleen Hicks, the Deputy Secretary of State, where they said basically we're planning a war that, quote, lasts years. That was in Reuters. And so, Putin's demands, as I say here, are that, Ukraine declare neutrality. Primarily his demands are that, Ukrainian neutrality, that Kiev recognize the Donbass republic's independence, and recognize Crimea as Russian territory. And these are, I think, reasonable requests. And certainly if we want to end the bloodshed, the best way to do it would be for the U.S. and NATO to admit fault and to help Ukraine reach some kind of negotiated settlement here to end the war. But instead, what we're doing is, as Zelensky has indicated, even before, that even in the lead up to the war, he asked NATO straight up, like, are we ever going to be in the alliance? And they told him, he goes, in a year or 2 years, 5 years, whatever the timeline was. And they go, no, NATO, you'll never be in NATO, but publicly the door will remain open. And there's been these revelations recently about how, from this counselor to Blinken, named Derek Chollet, who revealed on the War on the Rocks podcast last week that they never put rescinding that invitation, which was impossible and wouldn't have happened anyway because of for a number of reasons, but also, in particular, the objections of Paris and Berlin. They never took it off the table, and he even said, like, so dismissively, that it's not what do you call it, a non-issue, and that we didn't take that seriously. It's not a genuine interest of Russia, when of course it is. As we've known for years and years, this is the brightest of all red lines for Russia, as Bill Burns, when he was ambassador, told Condoleezza Rice after speaking with Lavrov and a bunch of other, Russian figures in the government. And so, as I say here, that Washington should be leading the push to reach a diplomatic settlement. But of course, Blinken has not spoken with Lavrov since the 15th of February, since they cut off talks with Lavrov officially before Russia invaded, and they cut off Nord Stream 2. And of course, they're encouraging Russia to be, as we just talked about, the ambassador in the U.S., he says he's under blockade, and nobody's talking to him. And of course, the political costs, because of the culture built around this, of actually talking to the Russians. Look at Thomas Massie. They're talking, or any of these people, even people like Tulsi Gabbard and Tucker Carlson. They're people even on The View. Or people like Mitt Romney, they're calling these people traitors, and at least on The View, they were saying they should be arrested, because they're a part of a Russian disinformation campaign or something like this. So the climate is extremely toxic, and it almost makes any common sense consensus on all of this virtually impossible. So we're in a very dangerous time, and of course. When Jake Sullivan says things like we're going to give Ukraine the weapons it needs to beat back the Russians. My point was that that's not really possible any more than you could conceivably do. Some foreign power could do that to, and arm Mexico in a war with the U.S. I mean, Mexico can't win a war with the U.S. So, they know that, but, this is designed to bleed Russia and to isolate it on the world stage and make it a complete pariah and destroy its economy. And of course, this has been outlined by Zbigniew Brzezinski and Hillary Clinton. They've compared it, and as you said, Stavridis in the New York Times and elsewhere. There were articles in the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal leading up to the invasion where the hawks were publicly declaring, months before Putin's invasion, that the plan was that they didn't say like draw them in, but they enacted policies that guaranteed virtually that Russia would intervene in Ukraine militarily. And they said, and if they do, we have this whole plan B, which is looking more and more like it was plan A, to launch a long-term bloody insurgency that they're comparing all the while to the war in Syria and the war in Afghanistan in the 1980s. Whereas, as you said earlier, 1 million people died in Afghanistan, 15,000 Soviet soldiers. Of course, the latter number there is all that matters to the hawks, and the fact that they think that that's what brought down the Soviet Union. The fact that 1 million Afghans died and that there was 30 more years of war, and that backing people like Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri and Abdul Salam led to blowback on including 9/11 and then the whole war on terror after that. Where millions died directly and indirectly, cost America trillions and trillions of dollars, and of course broke our economy, much like the Vietnam War did, where millions were killed in that conflict in Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam as well. So, and after that, the idea was, well, we've come down with this Vietnam syndrome, so maybe we could do the same thing to the Soviets. Instead of trying to contain them, bait them into this overexpansion. And we've even heard hawks, like you said, talking about Syria, where they're like, well, we can bleed Russia this way. So now they've really gone ahead and done this. And the thing is it's much more dangerous. As bad as Operation Cyclone was, of course, that was thousands of miles away from Russia. Ukraine is on NATO and Russia's borders, so replicating the strategy there is a recipe for World War III. And of course, I think that as I say here, the Hawks really needed a victory after the massive failures in Vietnam and the era of stagflation and, the whole. I mean, it's not too dissimilar, with all the distrust in the media and the lag and the economic situation. You look back, all the we don't have anything really approaching the church committee hearings and the Rockefeller hearings now. But if you look at the, of course, all the revelations and documents that were revealed by WikiLeaks over the years, the real sort of growth of independent media and the popular, the fact that people have woken up to things like the deep state and like the military industrial complex and like it's an overused term, I suppose, but fake news and how that plays quite a bit into propaganda proliferated by the war state and how the American people are propagandized relentlessly on issues of war and peace, and that we are lied to, and that the Americans go in and spend trillions of dollars and like in the case of Iraq, kill millions of people. So now they need another victory. And so and I think as well, I think the American people are projecting all of their guilt and insecurities and shame and failures and their complicity in allowing all this to go on these last 3 decades or so. Let's just say since the Cold War ended. And they're projecting all of that onto the Russian people and onto Putin himself. And we're making the Russians pay. But the problem is that by allowing all this to go on autopilot, we are absolutely setting the stage for a much wider conflict. And as Daniel Larison has a great piece at antiwar.com today about how this isolation campaign has not worked in the past and has not been tried with a major power like this since the Second World War. And the last time this happened, we got ourselves into World War II. So we should be very, very, this is, I think we're in very uncharted waters right now. And it's I don't know. All I can do is continue to keep track of the escalations and point out where things are headed.
All right, Connor. Thanks so much for coming back on the show today and great article. Just everybody check out the Libertarian Institute if you can. Help us to finish up our fund drive, matching funds right now. If you donate, $100 becomes $200 very easily if you head on over to libertarianinstitute.com/donate today. Thanks, Connor.
Thank you. And I'll just point out really quick, Keith Knight and I are going to be holding an event in Mesa at the Beer Research Institute. It's our first Libertarian Institute event so far that we're going to be holding. It's sort of a get-together for libertarians in the area. If anybody's interested, send Keith or I a DM, and we'll give you the details and look forward to seeing you there. Thanks, everybody.
And
Thanks.
I should mention, too, Connor, it's good that you mentioned events. I'll go ahead and say I will be speaking in Denver at the Liberty on the Rots event May 4th, and then May 7th I'm in San Antonio with the sponsor of the show, Paloma Verde and Los Libertinos, for an event. And if you want details on that, hit up Carlos Ablar, the host of Los Libertinos and the head of Paloma Verde. And then I will be going to Reno at the end of May for the Libertarian Party convention. So if you will be there and you like the show, come chat and stuff. I'd like to meet people. So thanks, Connor.
Thank you, Kyle. Thanks, everybody.